On a late-night flight from New York to London, everything seemed perfectly ordinary until a black woman in first class was asked to leave her seat, simply because she didn't look like someone who could afford to be there. No argument, no outrage. She just stood up quietly, gathered her belongings, and stepped aside under the cold stare of the flight attendant and the uneasy, averted eyes of everyone around her. But what no one realized was that woman was the very engineer, the PhD, who had designed the software controlling that very aircraft's engines. What would you do if you were humiliated in front of a crowd? Just because of your skin color, would you stay calm, knowing the person judging you is the one supposed to serve you? And how would you react when, just a few hours later, the entire plane can't even take off without you? That night, it wasn't only the skies that were grounded, it was the conscience of an entire system. This isn't just a story about a flight. It's a lesson about intellect, dignity, and the way justice may take off slowly, but it always takes off. If you believe self-respect can create miracles, hit like, share, and subscribe as we begin the story of Dr. Amara Lewis under the dim lights of JFK Airport's departure gate. Dr. Amara Lewis stood quietly, clutching the black case that held her presentation for Europe's largest aviation conference. She was bound for London, where she would deliver the keynote on a new generation of engine control algorithm software she herself had designed. It was supposed to be just another business trip, until people stopped looking at her with respect and started looking with suspicion. When Amara boarded the plane, she was guided to seat 2A, first class. The ticket had been purchased through her company account, but that didn't seem to matter to the lead flight attendant that night, Heather Collins. Heather had the crisp posture of someone trained to perfection, a smile practiced down to the millimeter. Yet behind that smile flickered something harder to define: polite disdain, wrapped in courtesy. She glanced at Amara, then deliberately scrolled through the passenger list a little too slowly. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Are you sure you're seated in 2A?" she asked, her tone laced with surprise. Amara smiled lightly. "Yes, that's right. I have my boarding pass right here." Heather didn't take the ticket. She simply bowed her head in a half-hearted gesture and stepped aside, leaving a chill in the air. From seat 3A, an older gentleman named Robert Stanton, a retired lawyer, watched the scene unfold. He knew that look, that brand of conditional politeness all too well. You didn't need to do anything wrong. You just had to look different. As the aircraft prepared to taxi, Heather returned, fussing unnecessarily over Amara's bag. "What do you have in there?" "Ma'am, we just need to make sure everything's safe for the flight." Amara's tone stayed gentle. "A laptop, some technical documents, and a book I'm reading. Would you like me to open it?" Heather flushed slightly, then muttered, "No, that's fine. Just protocol." Her voice tried to sound casual, but everyone nearby could hear the subtext: "I don't trust you." Dinner service only made that invisible line more visible. When Amara ordered the salmon, Heather replied flatly, "I'm sorry, that option's no longer available." Yet, minutes later, she served salmon to Robert. Robert raised an eyebrow and spoke loudly enough for the cabin to hear, "Funny you said the salmon was out. Yet here it is." The cabin went silent. Heather hesitated, then turned away. A younger attendant soon brought Amara the proper meal and a look of quiet sympathy. But it didn't end there. Heather returned once more, face tightened with false professionalism. "I'm sorry, but our system shows an issue with Seat 2A's confirmation. "May I see your passport and boarding pass again?" Amara calmly handed them over. "You could check that in your digital manifest." Heather stiffened. "We're just following procedure." Within minutes, citing non-compliance, she forced Amara to move to economy class. That image, a poised black woman in a tailored suit, rolling her luggage down the aisle under dozens of watching eyes, would stay with everyone in first class for a long time. Robert sighed, opened his laptop, and began drafting a complaint email to the airline's board. Amara said nothing, not because she was weak, but because she knew anger only legitimizes prejudice. As the plane left the runway, Amara sat in 24B, trying to close her eyes. But 2 hours later, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor technical issue and will be returning to JFK." Passengers murmured anxiously. No one knew that the glitch appeared in the aircraft's engine control software, the very system Dr. Amara Lewis had written. On the ground, the maintenance team scrambled. Contacting the operations center, they cross-checked the passenger manifest and froze. The one person most qualified, perhaps the only person who could fix the issue, was sitting in seat 24B, the same woman humiliated not long ago. Captain Lee Chen, a respected veteran pilot, stepped out of the cockpit and gently tapped Amara's shoulder. "Dr. Lewis," he said, his voice gravelly but sincere. "I'm told you're the lead author of the FADEC system for the A350 line. We could really use your help." There was no pride in his tone, only truth. Amara studied him for a long moment. She could have refused. Many would have, after what she'd endured. Instead, she sighed softly. "I'll help, but for the 200 people sitting here, not for your airline." Then she stood up. The cabin went silent. Inside the cockpit, Amara calmly reviewed the log data. Within minutes, she found the issue a rounding error in the temperature compensation algorithm, the kind only the original coder would notice. A few keystrokes later, the system stabilized. Warning lights went dark. When she emerged, the cabin erupted in applause from the very people who had looked away earlier. The airline did what it had to do. They issued a public apology, paid Amara a consulting fee, and terminated Heather Collins, the attendant who had been just following procedure. They even named their new anti-bias training program the Lewis Protocol. But Amara didn't stop there. She donated her entire consulting fee to establish the Lewis Ascent Fund, supporting young women of color pursuing aerospace engineering. "If someone like me could be doubted," she said in a later interview, "then maybe it's time we debug the code running our society." And Heather, rumor has it, she took a ground job at a small southern airport. No more rehearsed smiles, only a hollow stare whenever she watched a plane take off bearing her old company's logo. The words "Lewis Engine Certified" glinting on its side. The story of Dr. Amara Lewis spread across social media, not for revenge, but for the quiet strength of restraint. She didn't shout, record, or demand instant justice. She simply did what she did best, fix the error. Only this time, the bug wasn't in the code. It was in how people saw one another, because sometimes justice doesn't need a gavel or an apology. It just needs one person strong enough to stand up, do what's right, and let the world see how wrong it has been. In the golden hush of first class on the New York-London flight, soft light spilled over rows of leather seats, glinting off a woman quietly arranging papers on her lap. Dr. Amara Lewis, 34, aerospace engineer and jet engine control systems specialist. To those who didn't know her, She looked like just another well-dressed, composed traveler, a little distant, maybe, but to the aviation world, she was the name behind millions of safe flight hours across the globe. Her work wasn't as glamorous as the title doctor might suggest. It meant thousands of nights staring at black screens, hunting for errors in endless lines of code where the smallest misstep could cost a life. Among engineers, she was known for her near-obsessive precision, the kind of person who would spend 8 hours verifying a single equation off by 0.001. And today, she was heading to London to present at the International Aviation Conference, unveiling a new self-balancing thermal control system and algorithm that could cut fuel consumption by 7% on the A350 line. Amara's goal was simple: arrive safely, stay professional, deliver her keynote, the speech she'd been perfecting for 3 months. But that simple goal was about to be tested in a way she never imagined. Flying was second nature to her. She'd taken hundreds of trips, most for work. She knew every protocol, every checkpoint, and she knew the looks, those cool, scanning eyes that trailed her as she walked through the priority boarding lane. The look that said, "You must be in the wrong line." She had learned to smile. At 34, Amara understood that pride doesn't always need a voice sometimes. Silence itself is a form of resistance. She chose a pale gray suit, hair neatly tied, low heels polished, but not flashy. In her case were 48 pages of presentation notes, several technical schematics, and a small USB drive holding the final version of her algorithm. To her, that was more valuable than luggage. When she boarded the aircraft, she expected a few quiet hours' time to reread her notes and center herself for the morning ahead in London. Her seat, 2A, by the window, private enough to rest, close enough to hear the hum of the engines, a sound she always found comforting. But peace wasn't on the flight plan that night. Moments after she sat down, the click of high heels echoed on the aisle, followed by a voice so practiced it sounded almost mechanical. "Excuse me. Ma'am, are you sure this is your seat?" 2A. It was Heather Collins, the lead flight attendant, slender, blonde hair pinned tight, a smile by the book, and eyes that searched for flaws. Amara nodded gently, holding out her ticket. "Yes, that's right. Here it is." Heather's gaze flicked across the boarding pass, pausing just long enough to hunt for anything out of place. "Oh, just making sure," she said in that even tone. "Usually, our first-class passengers are served before the final boarding group is called." No explanation was needed. That single line carried an entire system of bias. "You don't look like you belong here." Robert Stanton, the older man in 3A, heard everything. He didn't interrupt. He just watched as Amara smiled the kind of polite smile successful black professionals learn over a lifetime just to survive. Amara turned toward the window. Out on the runway, blue lights traced paths for other night flights leaving New York. She thought of her mother, once a nurse, who used to say, "When they try to pull you down, keep your head high, because in the end, there's only one thing that makes people bow: the truth." She didn't know that in just a few hours. The truth would make an entire airline bow before her. Amara's story, like so many others, isn't just about being underestimated. It's about how she chose to respond. She didn't need anger. Anger would only make the guilty feel justified. Instead, she chose calm dignity and let her actions speak louder than any confrontation. That night, as Heather Collins flexed her authority over the smallest things, the bag, the meal, the seat, she had no idea she was playing a power game with the very person who had written the brain of the aircraft she stood on. An A350 can't take off if its engine control system fails. And if anyone in the world knew how to fix that, it was the woman Heather had just looked down on. When the cabin doors sealed, Amara took a slow, steady breath. All she wanted was a few hours of sleep. She didn't yet know that this red-eye flight wouldn't just take her to London. It would take the whole world on a journey through prejudice, dignity, and intellect. Because justice doesn't always arrive dressed as a courtroom or a lawyer. Sometimes it comes in the quiet form of a woman sitting in seat 24B, ready to rise when the entire system needs her, even when that system is the one that hurt her. And that was the moment real power changed hands, when those who thought they held authority were forced to ask for help, and the one they dismissed became the reason their world could keep flying. Life, sometimes, has a very elegant way of teaching lessons. The doors of first class sealed shut, and the air around Dr. Amara Lewis filled with the soft scent of coffee and expensive perfume. The engines purred a steady heartbeat beneath the cabin's quiet. Everything seemed calm again after that brief clash between suspicion and her composed smile. But sometimes, the deepest wounds don't come from shouting or open insults. They come from the tiny needles of contempt, disguised as courtesy. Heather Collins, the lead flight attendant, walked down the aisle with the poise of someone who believed she owned the space. She didn't say anything overtly rude, didn't break any rules, yet every gesture, every glance, every carefully chosen word carried the same quiet message: you don't belong here. When she poured drinks, she didn't ask, "Dr. Lewis, what would you like?" the way she did with the others. Instead, she said flatly, "2A. What'll you have?" as if she were talking to a seat number, not a person. Amara looked up calmly. "Just water with a slice of lemon, please." A moment later, Heather returned and handed her a glass. No lemon. "Sorry, we're out," she said smoothly, lips pressed tight, as if everything made perfect sense. But 5 minutes later, Amara watched her serve cocktails to the passenger in 1C, both glasses garnished with bright, fresh lemon slices. No explanation was needed. That was a microaggression, a cut that doesn't bleed. People who've lived inside a body marked by bias know it well. It doesn't kill you outright, but it shaves off pieces of your dignity, one small act at a time. Amara stared at her water, the faint smile fading from her lips. She didn't snap back. She didn't let anger win. Instead, she quietly took out her pen, opened her notes, and kept reviewing her presentation, because she knew losing her composure would be the only victory Heather could claim. Behind her, Robert Stanton, the older man with silver hair and sharp eyes, watched the whole thing unfold. He saw how Heather spoke cheerfully to the white passengers nearby leaning in, smiling perfectly, then turned to Amara with a colder, clipped tone. He'd seen it before, hundreds of times. He didn't need a law degree to recognize what was happening, but as a retired attorney, he knew exactly what it was. The cabin air shifted. No one said anything, yet an invisible line had been drawn. Heather kept passing Amara's seat, ignoring her completely while hovering over others with practiced warmth. When one passenger asked for another napkin, she replied instantly, "Of course, sir." But when Amara pressed the call button to request a blanket, Heather appeared 10 minutes later, sighing. "I'm busy right now. Can you wait?" Amara only nodded. No anger, no edge, just quiet endurance. But in her eyes, That small flame of self-respect still burned something Heather could never understand. People often think racism looks like shouting or violence, but in Heather's world, it was the art of subtle exclusion, no need for words, just the quiet power of making someone feel they don't belong. During meal service, Heather returned with her tray. Beef or salmon? 2A salmon, please, Amara said politely. Heather scribbled a note and left. Minutes later, she came back and set down a tray of beef. Sorry, we're out of salmon. Amara glanced around. Just ahead, 2 passengers had been served the same dish she'd requested. I thought I heard she began. Heather cut her off, tone clipped. I already checked. This is what's available. Robert had seen enough. He stood slowly, voice calm but firm. If you're out of salmon, I'll gladly switch meals with Dr. Lewis. I actually prefer beef. Heather froze, the lie exposed. Her cheeks flushed as she forced a brittle smile. No need. Sir, I think I can find one more portion for Dr. Lewis. Amara looked toward Robert and gave a quiet nod, a small gesture of thanks. For the first time on this flight, she felt something like solidarity. No speeches, no arguments, just one small act of fairness to balance the scales. Later, as Heather passed by again, Amara caught a whisper meant for a colleague. Some people think they're special just because they've got a PhD. The words were low, but not low enough. Amara sighed softly, turning to the window. Outside, the wing shimmered under the runway lights, a silver slash against the dark. The world, she thought, still has a lot to learn about how to treat people. But there was no bitterness in her heart, only quiet sadness at how small cruelty could turn something beautiful, like a peaceful flight, into something heavy. Robert leaned toward her and murmured, "Don't let her drain your energy. People like that only understand power, never dignity." Amara smiled faintly. "I'm used to it," she said, then added, almost to herself, "I just wish I didn't have to be." The words hung in the air like a truth no one wanted to touch because no one should ever have to get used to being treated that way. Heather continued to circle the cabin, clinging to her small sense of control. She built her own little circle of friendly passengers, the familiar faces, the familiar skin tones. They laughed, traded business cards, and Heather joined in like it was a cocktail hour. Amara sat outside that circle, quietly folding her notes, reopening her laptop, and returning to her work. Her focus was her armor, but the cabin's air had changed metallic, laced with arrogance and artifice, and somewhere inside, Robert sensed that trouble was coming. He saw the irritation simmering in Heather's eyes, frustration that the woman in seat 2A refused to react the way she wanted. Heather wanted a scene. She wanted Amara to break to give her a reason to call her disruptive. But Amara never gave her that satisfaction. She stayed calm, and that composure only made Heather's anger burn hotter. Outside, the engines began to roar, the deep hum rising as the plane readied for takeoff. The aisle lights flickered blue. In that moment, amid the clinking of glasses and the hum of reclining seats, Amara closed her eyes. She didn't know it yet, but the calm she held on to so tightly was about to become the most powerful weapon on the plane, because just a few hours later, when that same aircraft refused to leave the ground due to a system fault, the world would finally see who truly didn't belong in that cockpit of arrogance. The soft lights of first class glowed warmly, yet the air felt thick as if something unspoken still hung between the rows. After a series of quiet clashes between Dr. Amara Lewis and the chief flight attendant, Heather Collins. Silence seemed to be everyone's safest choice. Everyone, except one man in seat 3A. Robert Stanton, a retired lawyer, had spent over 40 years in courtrooms defending those society had written off reclaiming justice for the ones no one listened to. Nearing 70. He'd seen every kind of power, every kind of person, from arrogant officials in uniform to the helpless crushed beneath systems they didn't understand. He thought nothing could surprise him anymore. But the way Heather looked at Amara, the curt 2A, what'll you have, instead of calling her by name? The faint smirk as she handed over a glass of water missing its lemon slice, it made his skin crawl. Not because it was new, because it was too familiar. Robert knew that tone. That was prejudice in uniform, polished, polite, and impossible to report. It was like getting slapped by a gloved hand. He looked at Amara. She said nothing, didn't frown, didn't flinch. She simply returned to her notes, pen moving with calm precision. Her composure reminded Robert of his late wife, a black woman who'd once been denied a promotion for being not the right image for leadership. She hadn't shouted or begged. She'd just worked harder, better, until the same boss who doubted her had to sign her promotion letter himself. She has that same energy, Robert thought, that quiet kind of strength. When Heather came back to recheck Amara's passport and boarding pass for the second time, Robert lowered his magazine. He listened closely, and when Heather muttered, "Seat 2A seems to have a system error," he recognized what she was doing, setting up a pretext, a technical excuse to remove someone she didn't want there. He'd seen this playbook before, different setting, same script. Removed for procedural reasons, a misunderstanding, just following protocol, every phrase a shield for bias. He almost stepped in, but before he could, Amara smiled that soft, unbreakable kind of smile. "Of course," she said. "Please, take your time. I want you to feel sure." Her tone wasn't angry, yet something in it made Heather falter just for a second. Robert felt it too. Anyone who could stay that calm under such quiet cruelty wasn't weak. She was confident in something, maybe in herself, maybe in truth. He decided, right then, that if things went any further, he wouldn't let her stand alone. Moments later, Heather returned to the galley, pretending to scroll through her manifest. Robert overheard her whisper to another attendant, "I don't know why the airline keeps putting people like that in first class. Must have been a discount ticket." Her voice was low, but not low enough for a man trained to hear every syllable of testimony for 40 years. Robert exhaled slowly, turning toward Amara. She was still calm, still silent. He leaned in slightly, his voice low but steady. "Dr. Lewis, if you need a witness, I'll be the first to sign my name. I've seen and heard everything." Amara looked up, a bit surprised. For the first time, their eyes met, gratitude glowing behind her calm. "Thank you." "Mr. Stanton," she said softly, "I hope it won't come to that, but it helps to know I'm not entirely alone." Robert nodded. The righteous only need one witness to keep the truth alive. From that moment on, something invisible connected them, a silent thread between a woman enduring injustice and a man who had spent his life naming it. One protected her dignity through silence, the other guarded her story through observation. Together, they became the only pair strong enough to keep justice aloft in midair. Heather must have sensed it. She began avoiding Robert's gaze, staying on the opposite side of the aisle whenever she passed. Robert, ever composed, opened his small leather notebook and wrote a single line, discriminatory behavior, subtle but evident. Chief Attendant Heather Collins, Witness R. Stanton, Seat 3A. The words were small, but later they would become key evidence in the airline's internal investigation. For now, though, Robert just felt the slow burn of restrained anger. He knew people like Heather, and he knew what unsettled them most wasn't protest, but dignified composure. And Amara, without even trying, was unraveling Heather's control one calm breath at a time. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Robert closed his eyes, listening to the low growl of the engines. He thought about the irony of it all. Some people sit in first class and still get treated like they don't belong. And others, even when pushed to the back, carry themselves like they're sitting at the top, not in rank, but in character. Moments later, Heather returned with that falsely official tone. "Ma'am, Seat 2A hasn't been verified. I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy." Robert opened his eyes. He didn't intervene, not yet. He trusted Amara's instinct. As she stood, she glanced at him. He met her eyes and gave a quiet nod, one that said, "I see you. I'm here. And I'll make sure this story is told." Amara nodded back, lifted her bag, and began walking down the aisle past the rows of silent passengers, across the invisible border between privilege and prejudice. She walked with her head high, not out of defiance, but out of truth. Robert watched her go. He knew somehow that this moment would grow into something larger than either of them, and sure enough, hours later, when the aircraft failed to take off due to a system fault, it would be Robert Stanton, the man in Seat 3A, who would testify that the airline had humiliated the very engineer capable of saving their flight. But that was still ahead. Right now, in the still air of first class, Robert felt only one thing. Sometimes, being an ally doesn't mean being a hero. Sometimes, it simply means being the one who refuses to look away. First class still glowed under soft amber light, but the comfort that once filled the cabin was gone. After the subtle confrontations and the quiet solidarity from Robert Stanton, it seemed things would settle into uneasy silence. But for people like Heather Collins, control wasn't just a duty, it was a pleasure of power. And when that power wasn't acknowledged, they'd find someone to impose it on someone they thought weaker. After clearing the dinner trays, Heather returned, wearing that kind of false concern that hides something sharper. She glanced down at the small black carry-on bag neatly placed under Dr. Amara Lewis's seat and asked, her voice silky soft but edged with suspicion, "Excuse me, ma'am, could you please store that bag in the overhead bin? It seems a little large for under the seat." Amara looked up. She knew perfectly well her bag met every regulation. She'd flown hundreds of times with this very airline and no one had ever questioned it. But she also knew some rules weren't enforced because of safety. They were enforced because prejudice always needs a reason to look official. "This bag's flown on every route I've taken, even with your airline," Amara said evenly. "It fits just fine under the seat." Heather pressed her lips together, forcing a polite smile. "We just want to make sure everything's safe. You know, some items aren't ideal to keep by the aisle." The words sounded harmless, but the subtext cut deep, a quiet suggestion that this black woman might have something dangerous in her bag. From Seat 3A, Robert lifted his head. He felt the shift instantly, that familiar brand of false security used as cover for bias. He'd seen it too many times in his career when procedure was weaponized to disguise discrimination. Amara met Heather's eyes not cold, not yielding. "If you're concerned for safety," she said calmly, "you're welcome to inspect it. I'll open it for you." The words were so calm, so poised, that Heather froze for a beat. That wasn't the reaction she expected, no resistance. Just a quiet invitation that stripped her of her self-assigned authority. "There's no need," Heather said quickly, retreating a step, but she couldn't resist adding, "We're just doing our job." Robert exhaled. He'd once defended passengers in discrimination lawsuits, people pulled aside, searched, or humiliated for security reasons. He knew that word safety, when abused, became the perfect armor for prejudice. As Heather left, Amara bent down to retrieve a small notebook from her bag. Its pages were filled with formulas, schematics, and codes only another engineer would understand. She paused on one handwritten line in the corner. "Safety is precision, not prejudice." She had written it for her own team years ago, and now it felt like the perfect reply. But Heather wasn't done. Moments later, she returned with a younger flight attendant in tow, her smile sugar-sweet and false. "We just need to re-inspect some personal items in the cabin," she said lightly. "Routine procedure." Robert looked up again. He knew that tone, that fake casualness. There's no such thing as a routine inspection for just one passenger. Amara stayed composed, set her bag neatly on the table, and said, "Of course, but please make sure this is officially documented by your airline." Heather froze. The words were soft, but every syllable landed hard. Documented meant accountability. Documentation meant oversight. And oversight was the one thing Heather hadn't counted on. "There's no need to make this formal." "Ma'am," Heather stammered, her hand retreating. "We trust you," Amara nodded, "and I trust your airline will uphold its professional standards. Thank you for your concern." It was too light to sound confrontational, yet heavy enough to make Heather swallow her pride. She turned away, but in her eyes flickered something sharper than irritation, the sting of being put in her place by someone she thought beneath her. Robert leaned forward slightly. "Dr. Lewis," he murmured, "you just reminded her what boundaries look like." Amara smiled faintly. "Sometimes all it takes is showing them you're fully awake." Between the clinking of dishes and the deepening hum of the engines, no one realized the balance was shifting. With every calm word and steady glance, Amara was dismantling Heather's illusion of power piece by piece, until the only thing left exposed was Heather's fear of losing control. As Heather passed by again, Robert caught her eye a brief, steady look that said, "I see you." It was quiet, but it hit its mark. Heather's face flushed red as she turned away. What she didn't know was that every gesture, every word, was being written down in Robert's notebook, a quiet record of truth that would soon make an entire airline bow its head. Amara, meanwhile, turned back to the window. The night sky brushed the wing in a thin line of silver. She thought of her father, the man who once told her, "You can't control how people treat you, but you can always control how you respond." And she was doing exactly that, meeting insult with intellect and bias with grace. In those few minutes of silence, no one in the cabin realized that Heather's little safety inspection had just become the turning point of the entire flight. Because hours later, when the engines failed and panic spread through the cockpit, they would have to call for the very woman Heather had treated like a threat to save them all. But for now, Amara simply sat there, smiling faintly at the night beyond the glass as if she already knew one simple truth. When truth takes flight, no prejudice on earth can keep it grounded. The first-class cabin had quieted down after Heather Collins' so-called safety inspection, thick with pretense, but silence didn't mean peace. It was only the stillness before the cracks began to show in Heather's polished facade. And, as it always is with those intoxicated by authority, Heather didn't know when to stop. When people like her fail to win with logic or rank, they resort to the pettiest ways of feeling powerful. When dinner was served, Heather reappeared, her smile perfectly restored as if nothing had happened. She leaned forward slightly, her tone smooth and practiced. 2A. What would you like for dinner? Beef or salmon, Doctor? Amara Lewis looked up and answered with a small, calm smile. Salmon. Thank you. Heather jotted it down and moved on. But when she returned with the meal, she set down a plate of cold beef. I'm sorry. We've run out of salmon, she said, her voice heavy with feigned regret. I hope you don't mind the substitution. Amara didn't respond immediately. She looked at the dish for a moment, then lifted her gaze steady, composed. That's fine, she said softly. I'm not picky. Her voice was calm, polite, but there was something in it that made Heather uneasy, the kind of composure that exposes everything around it. In Seat 3A, Robert Stanton, the seasoned lawyer, had seen the entire exchange. He watched Heather, moments earlier, serve a plate of bright, fresh salmon to the man in 1C, even encouraging him with a smile. The salmon's excellent tonight. Sir, you should try it. Robert's brow tightened. He didn't need more evidence. He'd spent 40 years in courtrooms, confronting prejudice so subtle it slipped through the cracks of the law. And now, it was unfolding right before him, except this time. The victim didn't need to speak a word to make the truth visible. Robert set down his silverware and spoke clearly, loud enough for the cabin to hear Ms. Collins. If Dr. Lewis requested the salmon and it's unavailable, I'll gladly switch with her. I actually prefer the beef. The air in the cabin went still. Heather froze Dr. Lewis. The title landed like a strike. From the start of the flight, she'd deliberately avoided using it. 2A had been more comfortable. It kept Amara in her place, a passenger, not an equal. Heather forced a shaky smile. Oh, how kind of you, sir. But it looks like we've just found another portion of salmon. I'll bring it right away for Dr. Lewis. The word slipped out too quickly. The lie was exposed not by accusation, but by courtesy. Robert nodded once, saying nothing more. He'd achieved exactly what he wanted to expose deceit, not with anger, but with grace. Minutes later, Heather returned with the plate of salmon. Apologies for the inconvenience, she said, trying to sound natural, though her hand trembled slightly as she set it down, eyes avoiding Robert's. Amara looked up, her smile genuine and serene. Thank you. I understand small mistakes happen sometimes. No sarcasm, no edge. But the words hung in the air like a mirror, reflecting Heather's pettiness more clearly than any rebuke could have. Just then, a young male flight attendant approached, professional yet noticeably tense. Heather, can you help serve drinks in the rear cabin? I'll handle things here, he said quickly. Then, turning to Amara with an easy smile, he added, I'm sorry, Dr. Lewis. Let me double-check your meal. I'll make sure it's just as ordered. Robert watched him and smiled faintly. The young man understood what was happening, and he chose to correct it quietly, without creating a scene. That kind of subtle courage diffused the tension, but it also made Heather's malice even more obvious. Heather stood frozen for a few seconds before walking away, her face flushed, her composure crumbling. The smile was gone. Amara ate slowly, each bite measured. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where runway lights slid backward as the plane prepared for takeoff. She didn't feel triumphant, only tired, because the price of composure is often having to watch someone unravel in their own smallness, knowing you can't save them from it. Robert leaned toward her slightly, voice low. "You know, sometimes all it takes is a dinner to reveal who's really hungry not for food, but for integrity." Amara let out a soft laugh, her voice deep and warm. "Maybe you're right, Mr. Stanton. Kindness has a way of exposing deceit faster than anger ever could." They fell into a comfortable silence, letting first class sink into that uneasy, half-quiet part, real, part pretending. Heather, though busying herself with trays and checklists, couldn't escape the feeling of their eyes on her, not judging, not mocking, just seeing everything. A few minutes later, the young attendant returned, placing a glass of lemon water on Amara's tray. "I heard you prefer a slice of lemon," he said gently. "There was a mix-up earlier, my apologies." Amara thanked him. She looked at the glass, the thin lemon slice floating on the surface, catching the cabin light a quiet, delayed apology from someone brave enough to do what his superior couldn't. Robert chuckled softly. "You see, Dr. Lewis, sometimes justice is just a slice of lemon. Late, but it still arrives." Amara smiled for real this time. "Yes," she said, "and sometimes it's a little sour, but it's worth the taste." The plane shuddered gently as it accelerated down the runway. None of them knew that in just a few hours. Heather would lose every ounce of control she clung to, and the world would see that the woman she'd dismissed was the only one who could save the flight. But for now, in that quiet cabin, the little drama over a salmon dinner had already revealed something far greater when grace and intelligence meet. Truth always finds a way to shine through. The first-class cabin had grown quiet again after dinner. The gentle clink of silverware, the low hum of the engines, the rhythm of a flight settling into calm. But for Heather Collins, that calm was unbearable. Dinner had left a scratch on her pride, a tiny, stinging reminder that she'd lost to Dr. Amara Lewis's composure, and to Robert Stanton's steady, knowing gaze that had torn down her mask in front of everyone. People who can't win with reason often turn to procedure, and Heather knew the power of the badge, the uniform, and the sacred phrase for safety reasons. With just the right pretext, she could twist her bias into protocol. Half an hour later, once the meal trays were cleared, Heather returned her face set, a small scanner in her hand. She tapped lightly on the back of seat 2A. Voice measured, wrapped in false professionalism. "Excuse me, ma'am. The system's showing a mismatch with seat 2A. It seems your information wasn't properly assigned. I'll need to recheck your passport and boarding pass. It'll only take a moment." Robert looked up. He caught the flicker in Amara's eyes. Not fear, just disbelief at how blatant this was. Calmly, Amara set down her notebook, opened her bag, and handed over her documents. "Here's my passport. You can scan the QR code on the boarding pass. I checked in online yesterday." Heather took them, but instead of scanning right away, she pretended to fiddle with the device, brows furrowed. Strange. The system says this seat isn't assigned to any passenger. Maybe there was an error." Amara tilted her head slightly. "An error?" It might have been a data entry issue, Heather continued, her tone louder now, just enough for nearby passengers to overhear. If you don't mind stepping to the back for a moment, we'll sort it out. Just a routine check to avoid any mix-up. It sounded procedural, but the intent was clear classic discrimination disguised as protocol turning bias into bureaucracy, so no one dared call it what it was. Robert sat upright, his voice calm but commanding. "Collins, I saw you scan Dr. Lewis's ticket when she boarded. Her name is on the manifest. I even heard you confirm it. What kind of system forgets a seat assignment after an hour in the air?" Heather stiffened. She forced a brittle smile. "We just want to make sure everything's in order." "Sir." "Order," Robert repeated slowly. "I've been a lawyer for 40 years. I know when someone's hiding behind procedure to justify prejudice. I suggest you stop before this gets out of hand." The entire cabin went silent. Heather's cheeks flushed crimson, but she managed to mumble, "I'm only doing my job." Amara's voice broke the tension soft, but steady. "It's fine. Mr. Stanton, let her check. If I'm in the wrong seat, I'll move. But I suspect Ms. Collins will soon discover something systems don't always malfunction. Sometimes it's just the user's perception that's flawed." She leaned back, eyes drifting toward the window. Posture relaxed, no trace of fear. In that moment, she didn't look like a passenger under scrutiny, but rather someone watching another person quietly expose their own weakness. Heather hesitated, then turned and walked away, clutching her scanner. Moments later, the young male attendant approached her and spoke in a low voice. "Heather, I just double-checked the manifest, Doctor. Lewis is confirmed in 2A with electronic verification. There's no system error." Heather froze, nodded stiffly, and murmured, "Thanks," before walking off faster than necessary. Robert glanced at Amara, a faint smile on his face, half admiration, half respect. "You just won a case without ever speaking in court." Amara smiled back, voice low but certain. "No, Mr. Stanton. I just let her become her own witness." From the front of the cabin came a faint gust of air, and somehow it felt like the balance of power in first class had quietly shifted. Amara leaned her head back, eyes closing for a moment. Her mind drifted to long nights in the engine lab, the times she'd had to prove herself twice as much to be believed half as much. She remembered the way people said, "You're an exceptional black engineer," as if her color were the exception, not her skill. She was used to that conditional kind of praise, and she knew Heather was just another link in that same flawed chain. When Heather returned again, her tone was softer, the fight gone from her voice. "My apologies, ma'am. There was a temporary connection error. Everything's fine now. You can remain in your seat." Amara opened her eyes and gave a small nod, her tone as calm as before. "Thank you. Sometimes systems just need a refresh." Robert heard the layered meaning beneath her words. The system she referred to wasn't just the seating software, it was the bigger one. The one still full of corrupted code called prejudice. Heather walked away without looking back. Her pride was bruised, her authority shaken. She couldn't understand why the woman she'd tried to humiliate didn't fight back, only smiled. But that's exactly why she'd lost. From his seat, Robert exhaled slowly. He'd defended hundreds of clients, but rarely had he seen someone turn another's contempt into such an elegant mirror. He glanced toward the window, the plane wing glinting under golden light, and had a strange feeling. He couldn't have known that in just a few hours. When warning lights began flashing in the cockpit, the crew would have to call upon this very woman whose papers they'd questioned to save them all. For now. The first-class cabin was silent again, but this time, it wasn't the silence of tension. It was the silence of power quietly changing hands, calm, controlled, and undeniable. The situation seemed to have settled after the paperwork check, but those who misuse power rarely stop when they should. Heather Collins, the chief flight attendant, still couldn't accept being defeated by a passenger who hadn't even fought back a passenger who'd kept her dignity, and somehow that made Heather lose hers. Her pride was bruised, and she decided to play one last hand, one she was sure would restore her authority. By now, the first-class cabin was dimmed. Passengers rested, some with their eyes closed. The hum of the engines and the whisper of wind outside wrapped everything in quiet calm. But inside Heather, a storm of arrogance and resentment raged. She couldn't stand the sight of Dr. Amara Lewis still sitting there in first class, calm, unbothered, radiant in her poise, as if nothing had happened. Heather needed an excuse, and for people like her, flight safety was always the perfect disguise. About an hour after takeoff, Heather approached Amara's seat, her face set in stern professionalism. Her tone carried the weary authority of someone pretending to just do their job. "Ms. Lewis," she said coolly, "we've received a report from the crew regarding your earlier uncooperative behavior. According to regulations, we need you to move to the economy cabin for the remainder of the flight. This is a temporary measure for safety and order." In that instant, the air seemed to leave the cabin. Robert Stanton, in seat 3A, lowered his magazine and stared at Heather in disbelief. Uncooperative behavior in her mouth. The words became a blade, sharpened by polite language, just enough to make humiliation sound procedural. Amara said nothing at first. She looked up at Heather, not angry, not afraid, just quietly sad. The kind of sadness of someone who's been through this too many times to still be surprised. "You want me to move to seat 24B?" she asked softly. Heather nodded, keeping her voice even. "Yes. If you refuse, we'll have to alert airport security in Frankfurt. I'm sure you'd rather avoid further complications." It sounded civil, but it was a threat dressed in etiquette. "If you don't bow, I'll make you pay." Robert rose from his seat, his voice low but firm. "Ms. Collins, I'm a witness. I've observed everything. You're exceeding your authority and displaying clear discriminatory conduct. Are you certain you want to continue this?" Heather didn't back down. "Sir, this is a crew decision. We're authorized to remove any passenger showing signs of disturbance." Amara stood slowly, not defensively, but with quiet grace. She placed a gentle hand on Robert's arm and said softly, "It's all right, Mr. Stanton. Sometimes, to keep the peace, we have to take the slower path not out of fear, but because we refuse to become like them." Robert looked at her, torn between frustration and admiration. He knew she wasn't surrendering, she was choosing to win with dignity. Amara gathered her bag, straightened her jacket, and began walking down the aisle. Her steps were steady, unhurried, her chin neither lifted in defiance nor bowed in shame. She walked like someone leaving a chessboard she'd already won, only the opponent hadn't realized it yet. Other passengers looked up. Some averted their eyes. Some shook their heads. A few whispered, unsure whether out of embarrassment or guilt on Heather's behalf. Heather stood still, watching Amara leave. a small smile tugging at her lips, the smile of someone who believed she had restored order. But she didn't realize that in that very moment, she had signed the verdict for her own career, because any power built on humiliation comes with an expiration date. Amara found her seat in 24B, in the economy cabin. The space was tighter, the air brighter, children crying in the background. But she didn't feel ashamed. She took a slow breath, closed her eyes, and thought, "It's not where you sit that defines your worth, it's how you walk away." Robert, still in first class, hadn't sat down. He opened his laptop and began typing an email to the airline's CEO, to the press, and to an old friend on the Civil Aviation Board. He knew justice didn't always shout. Sometimes it began with a single quiet click. Meanwhile, Heather returned to the galley, her face glowing with smug satisfaction. A younger attendant hesitated before asking, "Ms. Collins, was it really necessary to be that harsh?" Heather smirked. "Safety first," she said coldly. She needed to remember her place. But Amara's place wasn't in any seat number. It was in the hearts of those who had witnessed in the quiet pride that forced the powerful to face their reflection. An hour later, as the plane crossed the Atlantic, the world outside was pitch black, only the moonlight tracing silver across the wing. Amara sat still, her hand resting on her engineering notebook. Not a single tear. She'd spent years in boardrooms full of skeptics. She knew this truth well. Patience isn't weakness. It's the strength of someone who no longer needs others to validate her worth. Robert passed by, leaned down, and whispered, "Dr. Lewis, I'm sorry for those who don't know better, but trust me, this isn't over." Amara smiled faintly. "I know. Life always recalibrates itself like an engine system. When it loses balance, it finds its way back. We just have to avoid adding more fire to the fuel." Robert looked at her with deep respect. "You sound like someone who understands the world runs on principles, not emotions." Amara tilted her head slightly. "Because I've seen it, one faulty line of code can shut down an entire engine. Human prejudice works the same way." The plane continued its silent journey through the dark sky. Heather didn't know that at the very moment she forced Amara out of first class. The system logs had automatically recorded the name of the passenger she'd flagged. And just a few hours later, when the cockpit's engine control software would throw an error no one could fix, the crew would realize that the only person who could save the aircraft was the woman they'd labeled uncooperative. And when that moment came, the whole world would see justice doesn't need to shout. It only needs to wait for its turn to take off. The moment, Dr. Amara Lewis rose from her first-class seat. The air in the cabin froze. No one spoke yet. Every gaze said something: curiosity, confusion, a flicker of shame, and the heavy silence of those who simply didn't want to get involved. It was the kind of silence the humiliated know too well, the silence of witnesses who look away. Amara lifted the handle of her black travel bag, nodded gratefully to Robert Stanton, the one man who had dared to stand up for her, and stepped into the aisle. The cabin lights cast a soft golden glow across her face, revealing a serenity that almost didn't belong to this moment. Each step she took pressed into the carpet like a quiet imprint. Slow, measured, deliberate, as if she were walking a thin line between dignity and disgrace. Heather Collins, arms crossed and face stone cold, stood watching. She believed she had just taught that woman a lesson about knowing her place. But, in truth, The only one being exposed was her because sometimes, when we try to make others small, we reveal how small we've become ourselves. Robert watched her go. He didn't blink, because he understood what Amara carried wasn't just a handbag, it was the weight of every quiet soul ever wronged in silence. In his long legal career, he had seen countless walks of shame, people forced to bow so that others could stand taller. But he had never seen anyone walk with such calm authority. Amara passed each row, passengers leaning slightly aside, avoiding her as though her presence were a problem to sidestep. A middle-aged woman lowered her gaze. A young man pulled out an earbud, then pushed it back in. The space between her and them wasn't wide, but it felt as cold as an ocean. She could hear her own footsteps, hear the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, and thought, no one can take your dignity from you unless you hand it to them. When she reached economy, the young male attendant, the same one who had brought her the lemon slice earlier, hurried forward, gently taking her bag. "Dr. Lewis," he whispered, "let me help you find a seat. I'm truly sorry." Amara smiled faintly. "It's all right. You don't need to apologize for anyone else. I know some people still see." The young man bowed his head, unable to meet her eyes. And in that small, wordless moment, a seed of awareness took root, a quiet awakening that would change him forever. Meanwhile, back in first class, Robert Stanton opened his laptop. He didn't need time to think. The words were already formed. The subject line appeared on the screen, formal complaint, incident involving passenger Dr. Amara Lewis, Flight 178 to London. His fingers moved with precision, each sentence crisp, measured, like a courtroom statement cloaked in courtesy but heavy with consequence. "I am a passenger in seat 3A and a direct witness to a violation of service protocol and clear display of racial bias by Chief Flight Attendant Heather Collins." Robert detailed every minute how Heather had called her 2A instead of Dr. Lewis, denied the lemon slice, claimed her seat wasn't assigned, and ultimately forced her to leave first class. No anger, no exaggeration. Just a clean, factual record, the kind justice listens to. He paused for a moment, eyes lifting toward the cabin ceiling. Amara's earlier words echoed in his mind. Sometimes, to keep peace, we must walk slower. He smiled sadly. She walks slow, he thought, but precise, and I'll make sure the world keeps pace with her. Heather passed by, catching a glimpse of the open laptop screen. She tried to look indifferent, but the quick flicker in her eyes didn't escape Robert's notice. He closed the lid softly and murmured, just loud enough for her to hear, "There are reports I don't send to the airline. Ms. Collins. Some go straight to the board." Heather froze. She turned away quickly, but her hands clenched at her sides. For the first time, she felt something slip beyond her control, not from the passenger in 2A, but from an invisible force called justice, in the back of the plane. Amara settled into seat 24B. The steady hum of the engines filled her ears. The scent of coffee and the murmur of other passengers faded into background noise. Through the small oval window, moonlight brushed the wing a thin, unwavering silver line. She thought back to her early years in aerospace engineering. The presentations no one listened to because they couldn't believe a black woman understood jet propulsion algorithms. And now, here she was again, pushed to the back of the plane not because of a system error, but because the operating system of society still carried the same old bug prejudice. But Amara didn't feel hate. Only exhaustion, the kind that comes from having to prove what should already be self-evident. And she promised herself softly, tomorrow, they'll know who I am not by what I say, but by what I do. Up front. Robert hit send. He sat back, exhaling slowly. Around him, passengers began whispering quiet ripples spreading through the silence. I think she's some kind of engineer. One man in seat 1B murmured. She didn't deserve that. The woman beside him nodded. It's like they were just looking for a reason to push her out. Those whispers, faint but real, traveled through the cabin like small sparks beneath the surface. Robert knew then a seed of resistance had been planted. In economy. Amara closed her eyes, listening to the rhythmic hum of the engines. She didn't know that, in first class, a man was writing her story in a language the world couldn't ignore. But somehow, she felt it, because when justice begins to stir, it always makes a sound, soft but steady, like an engine preparing for takeoff. And just hours later, that same engine would command the world's attention. When the FADEC system threw a critical software error and the crew scrambled for help, they would discover the name behind the algorithm, Dr. Amara Lewis, the passenger they'd downgraded for non-compliance. In that moment, everything would change, because justice doesn't rush. It waits, and then it takes off. The plane settled into cruising altitude, and the cabin lights dimmed to a gentle glow. Most passengers drifted to sleep. Only the soft thrum of engines and the thread-fine hiss of wind outside remained. In seat 24B, Dr. Amara Lewis sat quietly, one hand resting on a small notebook, her gaze far away. She had no idea that in a few hours, this very aircraft, the one whose control system she'd helped build, would become the stage for fate's strange lesson in justice. Up in first class, Heather Collins finally began to relax. After forcing Amara out of her seat, she felt order restored. She walked the aisle, checked latches, flashed a professional smile. Everything looked perfect until the system chimed an odd little ping. At first, no one noticed. A light beep from the cockpit, then another longer, more urgent. Amber warning lights blinked, FADEC mismatch, engine 2 response delay. In the flight deck, Captain Lee Chen frowned. He'd logged thousands of hours on the Trent XWB engines powering the A350 and knew this was extremely rare. Strange, he murmured to his first officer. FADEC doesn't desync unless there's a software issue. The plane shivered, not violently, but enough for a few passengers to stir. Heather, mid-coffee pour, froze and forced herself to look calm. Probably a little turbulence, she said to the junior attendant. Don't alarm the cabin. But inside, unease began to rise, that peculiar feeling people call operational karma. In 3A, Robert Stanton glanced up as the fastened seatbelt sign relit. His brow creased. He'd represented an aerospace tech firm in the past. The subtle change in engine cadence told him this wasn't turbulence. It was a real systems problem. Minutes later, the captain's voice came over the PA. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor technical issue with the engine control system. For safety, we'll be returning to JFK for inspection. First class stirred with whispers, a little worry here, some grumbling there. Heather kept the smile on, reassuring. Nothing serious, just a routine check. Robert knew better. He looked out at the night and exhaled, interesting. Maybe the universe doesn't care for watching the innocent get humbled. In the back, Amara felt the shift immediately. To someone who'd helped design FADEC logic, That subtle tremor was familiar, a feedback oscillation from temperature sensor compensation. A rare fault, but she knew left unaddressed. It could create an asymmetric thrust response between engines. She gazed at the wing, moonlight silvering the surface, and a thought surfaced. There are lessons creation forces us to teach whether we want to or not. As the aircraft began to descend, the cockpit patched through to ground ops. Engineers at JFK pulled the data and offered a preliminary take. Looks like a software fault in the engine control chain. The signature matches a trial patch that wasn't fully updated. Captain Chen frowned. Impossible. This bird was serviced 2 days ago. Who approved that FADEC patch? The tech's voice came back. A little shaky according to records. The system was developed by Dr. Amara Lewis's team at Arian Systems. She's the principal author of the temperature compensation algorithm. Silence. Then the first officer said, almost to himself, "Did you say Dr. Amara Lewis? I saw that name on today's passenger list." Chen turned, startled. She's on this flight, standing near the cockpit door. Heather heard it, and her stomach dropped. She swallowed hard, face composed, hands trembling. That name, too familiar. It was the very woman she'd pushed out of first class, the one she'd humiliated hours earlier. The captain asked the cabin crew to confirm. Heather opened the manifest. Lewis, Amara, seat 24B. She sank into a jump seat, sweat beading at her temples. Robert watched her reaction. He didn't need to ask. He knew karma had just begun its work. 5 minutes later, Captain Chen stepped into the cabin, scanning faces as he moved down the aisle. When he reached economy, Robert leaned a bit, peering through the curtain, and smiled softly when the captain stopped at 24B. "Excuse me," Chen said, voice respectful. "Are you Dr. Amara Lewis?" Amara looked up, a little surprised. "Yes, I'm Lewis." The captain's eyes carried the relief of a sailor sighting land. "We're seeing a FADEC anomaly, a software fault in the thermal compensation chain. Ops confirmed you authored this algorithm. I need your help. Otherwise, we may have to declare an emergency." The cabin went silent. From a distance, Heather watched, bloodless. She could hardly believe it. The woman she'd dismissed as out of place was the only person who could save this flight. Amara met Captain Chen's gaze. She could have said no. She could have let their prejudice play out to its logical end. But that wasn't who she was. "For the passengers," she said quietly, "I'll help." As she stood, those nearby made way. Robert watched, pride and sorrow meeting in his eyes. Some people don't need authority to make others bow. They simply do what's right, even when they've been wronged. Heather pressed against the bulkhead, unable to look up. Amara passed her and paused for a single breath. No words, no glare, just a silence sharp enough to cut. It was that silence that made Heather lower her head. In the cockpit, Amara reviewed the data and scrolled through the logs, fingers moving quickly. Within minutes, she found it a rounding error in the compensation branch, small, but enough to delay engine response by 0.3 seconds. She keyed in a temporary override, then looked to Chen restart the FADEC chain and resync the engines. "When the indicators go green, you're clear to continue." 30 seconds later, the warnings went dark. The cockpit exhaled. Chen turned to her, gratitude plain in his face. "Thank you, Doctor. Without you, we'd have been forced to divert." Amara's reply was soft. "It wasn't me that saved you. Justice just chose its moment to correct the error. Outside the cockpit, Heather sat collapsed, tears streaking down. She didn't know whether to be ashamed or grateful to still be alive to learn the lesson. Robert watched and murmured to himself, "Sometimes karma doesn't need to shout. It just needs someone calm enough to show who truly knows how to fly." As the aircraft began turning back toward New York, the sky outside thickened into a heavy gray blue. Inside, no one spoke. Passengers sat belted in silence, some gripping armrests, others whispering prayers. But in the cockpit and at the ground operations center, a strange reversal of fate was unfolding, something that would later be remembered as the most ironic moment of justice ever witnessed in the sky. After Dr. Amara Lewis had entered the cockpit and helped Captain Lee Chen stabilize the system, the airline initiated an emergency review at the JFK Technical Command Center. Flight data streamed in via satellite. Engineers leapt from their desks, eyes locked on glowing monitors. "FADEC mismatch, that's odd," a young engineer murmured, frowning. "This kind of error only happens if the software's out of sync with its version control." The technical lead, a man with 20 years in the field, barked to trace the last software patch approval. "I want to know exactly who wrote that line of code." A few keystrokes later, the scrolling data halted on a single entry. "Lewis, Amara, lead systems engineer, thermal compensation algorithm." The room went silent. Another engineer looked up. "Wait, that name sounds familiar. Isn't she—" The team lead cut him off, his voice taut. "Don't tell me she's on that plane." One more click. The passenger manifest appeared, seat 2A, Dr. Amara Lewis, JFK, LHR, boarding confirmed 2047. The air drained from the room. The lead engineer stared at the screen, disbelieving. "You've got to be kidding me. The chief systems engineer is sitting on the very flight that just glitched, and in first class." The younger engineer gave a nervous laugh. "If she's on board, why hasn't anyone called her?" The lead's expression darkened. "Maybe," he said slowly, "because they don't know who she is." And in that instant, everyone understood what that meant. The only person capable of fixing the problem was the same woman the flight crew had humiliated and forced out of first class. The update was transmitted back to the flight immediately. In the cockpit, Captain Chen received the call. "Confirmed passenger in seat 2A is Dr. Amara Lewis, lead FADEC systems engineer. She authored the algorithm in question. She's the only one who can assist." Chen turned toward Robert Stanton, who stood nearby, calm and composed. "She's the inventor?" Chen asked, stunned. Robert nodded, "Yes. And if I'm not mistaken, your chief flight attendant forced her out of that seat a few hours ago." Chen shook his head, disbelief and regret blending across his face. He said nothing more, just motioned to open the cabin door. And the moment Heather Collins heard that confirmation, the blood drained from her face. "Dr. Lewis, the chief engineer of the engine system," she whispered, voice cracking. Robert turned to her, his tone calm but sharp as a blade. "That's right. You sent the only person who could save this flight to the back of the plane. I think your safety procedures are due for a major update." Heather froze. Every excuse, every corporate phrase about following protocol collapsed into emptiness. She remembered holding Amara's boarding pass, pretending to recheck the system just to humiliate her. Now, those moments replayed in her mind like a film in reverse, each frame cutting deeper into her pride. Meanwhile, Amara, still in the cockpit, had no idea that the ground center's discovery had thrown the entire airline into chaos. She focused on the code streams, scanning each parameter. Her hands moved swiftly, her voice calm. There was no arrogance, no vindication, only the absolute professionalism of someone who puts duty above ego. Captain Chen watched her work, then whispered to his first officer, "How ironic. The passenger labeled a safety risk is the one holding everyone's safety in her hands." The co-pilot exhaled. "Seems like God's writing the script tonight." In the cabin, Heather stood rooted at the rear galley, staring at the faint glow spilling from the open cockpit door. Through it, she saw Amara, pale blue blouse, hair tied neatly back, small frame steady against the turbulence. With each movement Amara made, Heather felt the world tilting, rebalancing itself. Robert sat quietly, watching. He knew some moments required no court, no verdict justice simply found its own way to appear. And the miracle of it was that it always arrived at the exact moment humanity needed it most. When the plane finally stabilized, Captain Chen opened a channel to ground control. Fault manually corrected by Dr. Lewis. Engine response stable. FADEC synchronization restored. Applause broke out across the JFK operations room. A young engineer murmured, "She just saved 100 lives. But I heard she got kicked out of first class earlier." The lead engineer sighed. "Yeah, after tonight, this industry's gonna need a refresher course in judging people." Back in the air, Captain Chen stepped out of the cockpit and found Robert. "I'd like to thank her personally," he said. Robert glanced toward the back, where Amara had quietly returned to seat 24B, as composed as ever. "She doesn't need thanks, Captain," he said softly. "Just make sure no one like her is ever treated that way again." Heather stood nearby, unable to meet their eyes, but Chen didn't look away. "Ms. Collins," he said firmly, "I'll be filing a report. Not for the technical fault, for the attitude. A flight is only safe when the people running it have the right character." Heather bowed her head. For the first time in her career, she had no defense. The plane continued its flight, wrapped in a strange, peaceful quiet. Throughout the cabin, whispers spread. The woman kicked out of first class just saved the entire plane. The rumor grew like wildfire, but Amara stayed silent. She opened her notebook and wrote a single line, "There is no coincidence in justice, only timing." Robert leaned toward her and smiled faintly. "You know, Dr. Lewis, they'll be telling this story for years." Amara smiled back, her voice calm as the night beyond the window. But what matters is that they remember never judge someone by the seat they sit in." And somewhere above the Atlantic, in the quiet sky between dusk and dawn, karma kept on turning silent, precise and beautiful, like the very lines of code Amara once wrote. The cockpit was still heavy with silence after Amara Lewis resolved the FADEC software fault, but somewhere inside that quiet, you could feel the entire axis of things begin to shift. The flight was stabilizing. Yet, within everyone, another kind of tremor was spreading, a tremor of realization. Captain Li Chen sat pensively in the right seat, eyes on the numbers easing back into normal. He'd flown for over 20 years and weathered countless incidents. But he had never felt this ashamed, not because of a technical failure, but because of how poorly people could treat one another. He drew a long breath and stood. The cockpit door opened, and the cabin's warm. Amber light spilled in, faces turned toward him, waiting. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, He walked slowly down the aisle to 24B, where Amara Lewis sat. She remained composed, fingertips resting lightly on the edge of her notebook, as if nothing at all had happened. The captain stopped and spoke in a low, sincere voice. "Dr. Lewis, I owe you an apology not only for the technical incident, but for the way you were treated on this very flight. I apologize on behalf of the entire crew." The cabin went utterly still. Those who had watched it all unfold lowered their eyes, some nodding faintly, others biting their lips. Heather Collins, standing at a distance, clenched her hands and didn't dare look up. Amara lifted her gaze. There was no bitterness in her eyes, only a calm weariness. She spoke slowly, each word soft but unmistakably clear. "I didn't do this for my pride. Captain, I did it for everyone sitting here because they deserve to be safe. But if the airline wants me to continue assisting, I will do that as a professional, not as someone making amends for others." The captain nodded an unconditional yes contained in the gesture. "I understand. What do you require?" Dr. Amara met his eyes, unflinching. 3 things. First, an emergency consulting contract, $5,000 an hour, minimum 4 hours. I don't work for free. Professional responsibility must be respected. Second, a personal apology letter from the airline's CEO, not an internal memo, but an official acknowledgement. And lastly, she paused, voice dropping, "I don't want to see Ms. Heather Collins in this cabin again. Not on this flight, and not on any flight I'm on in the future." No one breathed. No one moved. It wasn't merely a set of demands. It was the declaration of a woman who had been demeaned and now reclaimed her dignity with intellect. From nearby, Robert Stanton felt his throat tighten. He knew that if Amara had chosen anger lawsuits, shouting, public scenes, she could have thrown the entire airline into chaos. But she didn't. She chose to put the terms on the table not with emotion, but with clauses. And that was why the whole cabin bowed to silence. Captain Chen was quiet for a few beats, then replied, "Dr. Lewis, I agree to everything. I'll contact operations immediately to confirm the contract. And I guarantee Ms. Collins will be relieved from duty at once." Heather went rigid. She wanted to speak, say it was all a misunderstanding, but the words jammed in her throat. She knew as well as anyone there was no defense left to give. Amara turned to her. Her eyes held no anger and no pity, only the clarity of a mirror. "Ms. Collins, before you doubt someone next time, check the integrity of your own system. Sometimes what needs maintenance isn't the software, it's the prejudice." A soft sigh rippled through the cabin. A middle-aged passenger began to clap, then another joined, and another. Within seconds, the cabin applauded not for a gotcha moment, but for the grace with which Amara held on to kindness even when she had the power to strike back. Robert murmured to the person beside him, "That is what power looks like when someone knows their value. She doesn't need to raise her voice to be heard because the whole world falls quiet when she speaks over the interphone." Captain Chen requested another attendant to replace Heather, who was reassigned below. The order left Heather stunned. She walked slowly down the aisle, the same path Amara had been forced to take hours earlier in humiliation. This time, the roles had reversed. She was no longer the one in control. She was the one under every watching eye. Each footfall sounded like a warning bell to anyone who'd ever believed themselves above others. Amara watched her go and gave the faintest nod, not from satisfaction, But from knowing this truth, every system, whether mechanical or human, is only truly safe when it learns to detect its own faults. With Heather gone, Amara returned to the cockpit with the captain. She laid out the algorithmic fault in detail and explained a durable fix to prevent recurrence. Her voice was even concise and fully professional. No one on the crew dared interrupt. About 20 minutes later, the panel read, "All green." Captain Chen exhaled and turned to her. Voice unsteady. "I've sent the request to headquarters. Your emergency contract is approved, and the CEO is drafting the apology letter. I've never seen anything like this. Doctor." Amara's smile was slight, her eyes carrying the steady calm of someone who had walked through bias before. Perhaps things like this happen often, they're just rarely allowed to play out in full view. Robert nodded slowly. She was right. Prejudice wasn't rare. It was merely covered with coats of rules, procedures, and safety. But once exposed, it couldn't hide again. As for Heather, alone in the service bay, tears traced down her cheeks. She kept hearing Amara's words, "maintaining your belief system." She had never felt the phrase fit so precisely. When the flight continued, Amara returned to seat 2A, the place that had been hers all along. People stood, quietly making way. Robert offered a gentle smile. "Welcome back to your seat." "Doctor," Amara replied softly. "Thank you, but I don't think I ever left it." Outside the window, sunrise edged up over the horizon. The first light of morning spilled through the clouds and across the wing, the same wing that had once shuddered under faulty code, now gleaming as if reborn. In that moment, Robert thought, not everyone gets to rewrite the bugs in their own story, but today she did through intellect, dignity, and a silence more powerful than any shout. The cockpit fell silent as Dr. Amara Lewis stepped inside. No one spoke. Instinctively, the crew shifted aside, making way for the very person they had once excluded from the right to be respected. Captain Li Chen gestured toward the engineer's seat, his voice soft but filled with reverence. "All systems are running in safe mode. Doctor, FADEC still reports a sync error. We didn't dare override without your confirmation." Amara nodded quietly. She pulled the auxiliary screen closer, her eyes scanning the flickering streams of data. In the dim cockpit light, her face seemed to glow with each line of code reflected across it. She read the endless log files as though they were a familiar book she'd written herself. From the doorway, Robert Stanton, seated near the cockpit entrance, leaned forward, watching. He had met many brilliant minds in his life, but rarely had he seen anyone this calm while holding the lives of hundreds and the weight of a system that had humiliated her in her hands. Amara spoke softly, her tone steady and assured. "The FADEC is stuck in a temperature-rounding loop. When the environmental sensor returns a value just below the 0.02 threshold, the compensation algorithm compounds the error. It delays engine response by about 0.3 seconds. Not critical yet, but if it continues, it'll create thrust imbalance between the wings." The first officer blinked. "You figured that out in just minutes." Amara smiled faintly. "I wrote this code. I recognize the way it speaks." That line froze everyone in place. Amid thousands of cold lines of code, she could hear the voice of her algorithm like a mother recognizing her child's cry in a crowded room. She worked methodically, opening sublogs, comparing data strings, her fingers moving quickly over the panel. Every keystroke was precise. No panic, no noise. Each motion radiated the quiet mastery of someone who knows that saving lives doesn't require drama, only accuracy. Captain Chen watched, admiration and shame mixing in his eyes. He remembered the moment hours ago when this same woman was forced from seat 2A and he, trusting Heather's safety judgment, had stayed silent. Now he was watching her sit exactly where she belonged, not because she demanded it, but because competence had silenced prejudice. "There it is," Amara murmured, stopping at a single line in the control branch. She explained the software used a rounding function instead of a cutoff. When ambient data falls between 0.09 and 0.02, the compensation input misfires. I'll run a temporary override, bypass that rounding, and force the backup calculation chain. Once we land in London, you'll need to issue a permanent patch. Captain Chen nodded gravely. "You have full authority, Doctor." Amara entered her credentials and began typing. Green text rippled across the monitor, then a soft beep. She looked up with a small smile. Override complete. FADEC will resync in 90 seconds. Everyone held their breath. The cockpit filled with the hum of fans and the sound of beating hearts. Then click. The amber warning light vanished. The displays glowed all green. A quiet clap from the first officer spread until the entire cockpit was applauding. Outside. Robert heard it and exhaled, a small smile crossing his face. "She did it," he whispered. "She didn't just save the flight, she fixed another kind of fault, the one in how people judge." Captain Chen turned to her, voice deep with gratitude. "Dr. Lewis, if you hadn't been here, I don't know what would have happened." Amara replied simply, "If I hadn't been here, someone else might have learned not to judge people by where they sit." The words made Chen bow his head. He said nothing more, only placed his hand over his heart in silent respect. When stability returned, Amara asked to step out. Heather Collins still sat in the jump seat, eyes red. She watched Amara walk past calm, unresentful, and felt a shame deeper than any reprimand. Amara stopped briefly beside her. "Sometimes, Heather, the ghost isn't in the software, it's in the human heart." Then she walked on, without turning back. The cabin was hushed. Passengers began to realize what had just happened. Whispers spread. "She's the chief engineer. She fixed the engines herself." The woman they sent to coach Robert sat back, warmth stirring in his chest. It wasn't that justice had arrived quickly. It was the way it arrived quiet, measured, profoundly human. An hour later, Captain Chen spoke over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, the technical issue has been fully resolved. The aircraft is now stable. On behalf of the crew, I'd like to extend our deepest thanks to Dr. Amara Lewis, whose direct assistance ensured everyone's safety." Applause thundered through the cabin. A few passengers stood, smiling toward her. Amara only nodded gently, turning her gaze to the window. The sky stretched wide and still, as if no turbulence had ever existed. In the bluish light reflecting across her face, one could see something brighter than any cockpit display the light of dignity. And in the back of the cabin, Heather lowered her head and whispered like a confession. "She didn't just fix the plane. She fixed me." Robert heard her. He smiled softly and opened his laptop, typing the first lines of the report he would later send to the airline board today, on a flight from New York to London. "We witnessed a lesson no classroom could ever teach. Justice doesn't need to shout, because when truth reveals itself, every prejudice collapses like a software bug patched in time. The plane soared toward the sunrise steady, certain, renewed. No more warnings, no more errors. Only a woman who proved that intellect, self-respect, and calm resolve can carry the entire world out of danger. When the final beep signaled system stability, the massive aircraft seemed to exhale a long, relieved breath. Every indicator light glowed green again. Captain Lee Chen gave a small nod, his hand still resting on the control panel, but his gaze fixed on the woman beside him. Dr. Amara Lewis gathered her data logs, removed her headset, and stood. She didn't say much, just smiled at the captain. A soft smile, but one that silenced the cockpit, a place ruled by logic, now stilled by grace. In the glow of the instrument lights, her face reflected the calm of someone who had simply done her duty, not someone trying to prove a point. "Thank you, Doctor," Captain Chen said quietly, his voice gravelly. "This entire flight owes you our lives." Amara shook her head. "No one owes me anything. Captain, we all just did what was right." She turned to leave. The cockpit door opened, spilling warm golden light from the cabin, and that's when the miracle happened. From the front row to the very back, applause began to rise. At first scattered, then united stronger, deeper, until it filled the entire cabin. Some passengers stood, others lifted their hands in greeting, as though welcoming someone returning from battle. Amara Lewis, once ordered out of seat 2A because she didn't look like she belonged in first class, now walked through those same aisles to applause that no one dared look away from. In seat 3A, Robert Stanton was the first to stand and clap. His smile was warm, his eyes glassy. As Amara passed, he said softly, "You didn't just fix the engines, you fixed the prejudice in this cabin." Amara nodded gently, continuing toward the front. She stopped at row 2A, the seat where, just hours earlier, Heather Collins had stood over her with that cold tone of authority. Now, the seat sat empty, reserved once again for her by direct order of the captain himself. Over the intercom, Captain Chen announced, by request of airline command and with the full consent of the crew, Dr. Amara Lewis will resume her original seat 2A. Applause erupted again, louder this time, echoing up to the cabin ceiling. At the far end of the aisle, Heather Collins stood frozen, her face pale. A corporate supervisor had just boarded midair for protocol oversight and now handed her a small envelope. Heather's hands trembled as she took it. "Ms. Collins," the supervisor said evenly, "effective immediately. You are suspended indefinitely pending investigation for violation of service ethics and evidence of bias. You'll be escorted upon landing. Please vacate first class." Heather stood motionless for several seconds, disbelief clouding her eyes as they darted around for someone to meet her gaze. But no one looked back. The colleagues who once admired her now avoided eye contact. The passengers who had stayed silent earlier now watched her with quiet gravity. Robert bowed his head slightly, as though closing a chapter. He whispered, "No one deserves humiliation, but sometimes only humiliation can wake a prideful heart." Heather walked slowly down the aisle, shoulders small, footsteps heavy, retracing the very path Amara had walked hours before. But there was a difference. Amara had carried dignity. Heather carried only emptiness. Amara took her seat at 2A. As she buckled her belt, a young flight attendant approached, setting down a glass of fresh lemonade and whispering, "Lewis, your salmon entree from earlier, We saved it for you." Amara smiled faintly, not out of joy, but because life had such a poetic way of closing its circles. "Thank you," she said. "Sometimes the smallest gestures are the most sincere apologies." After 3 more hours of system checks and paperwork, the JFK London Heathrow flight was cleared for takeoff once again. This time, when the plane lifted from the runway, no one spoke. The silence in the cabin wasn't fear, it was reverence. Everyone aboard knew they had just witnessed something worth remembering. At airline headquarters, the incident reached the executive board. Upon landing, the CEO personally signed the following decisions. Heather Collins, terminated, placed on the internal blacklist for 5 years. All staff to undergo mandatory training under a new program titled the Williams Protocol, inspired by this very event, with Dr. Amara Lewis serving as chief advisor. The program focused on recognizing unconscious bias, fostering equal service, and managing crises without prejudice of gender, race, or class. 3 weeks later, photos surfaced across the media. Amara shaking hands with the CEO outside company headquarters, holding a public letter of apology. She didn't deliver a long speech, only said this: "I don't want anyone else pushed to seat 24B just because they don't look like someone who sits in 2A. If one airline can learn that, then that flight wasn't wasted." From his home in Boston, Robert Stanton watched the news and smiled. In his journal, he wrote that day, "Justice didn't land. It flew right alongside her." As for Heather, months later she was seen at a small regional airport in Florida, working for a low-cost airline. No elegant uniform, no prestige, just quiet work. Yet, whenever she helped an elderly passenger to their seat, she always said, "Hi there. Is there anything I can help you with today?" And sometimes her eyes would flicker with a trace of sadness, remembering the woman who once sat in seat 2A. Meanwhile, Dr. Amara Lewis returned to her lectures, standing before her students in aerospace engineering. She recounted the incident not as tragedy, but as a case study in self-correcting systems. An aircraft learns from its errors to fly more steadily. She said, "People can, too. The difference is, a plane needs data, but people need courage to admit when they're wrong." As the class ended, she looked out the window where an A350 lifted gracefully into the sky. Under the sunlight, its silver wings shimmered like a message from above. A world without prejudice can always take off again if we dare to fix the fault instead of hiding it. When the flight finally landed safely at London Heathrow, passengers disembarked in order, but not in silence. You could still hear whispers among them, soft but full of feeling. That's the American engineer, the one who saved the plane. Not just that she taught the whole world a lesson. Dr. Amara Lewis stepped out of the cabin door, the early London light falling across her face. She didn't look back, because she knew it was over, at least in the skies. But inside her, another journey had just begun, a mission to fix not just software bugs, but the social systems that created them. Weeks later, the airline held a formal press conference. On stage, the CEO stood before dozens of cameras, his voice solemn yet sincere. "On behalf of the entire company, I offer a public apology to Dr. Amara Lewis for the unacceptable treatment she experienced aboard Flight 718. We take full responsibility and are committed to change, deep, structural change. Prejudice has no place in our skies." Applause filled the room. Reporters captured every moment, especially when Amara walked up calmly, unassuming, dressed in a simple gray suit. She didn't deliver a long speech. Just a few clear words. I don't need an apology to feel respected. I just need to see real, lasting change. Then she made an announcement that left the room silent. The entire settlement and consulting fee paid by the airline, nearly $750,000, would be donated to establish the Williams Ascent Foundation, named after her late mother, who had worked as a janitor at a technical university. This foundation will support young black women pursuing science, engineering, and aviation, so they don't just enter this world as students, but as the ones designing its future. That moment brought the audience to their feet. Some young female students in the crowd wept openly. Robert Stanton, Amara's fellow passenger, sat in the front row. He quietly removed his glasses to wipe them, pride glimmering in his eyes. In the months that followed, the Williams Protocol became a model program adopted by major airlines worldwide. It wasn't just a slogan anymore. It was real training focused on recognizing bias, ensuring equitable service, and handling crises without discrimination. The first line of the manual read, "Prejudice is society's software bug. If you don't update it, the whole system will crash." Heather Collins' life took a different path. After the incident, she lost her job and was blacklisted across the airline industry. For a long time, she couldn't find stable work. A year later, she was spotted wearing a faded uniform at a small airport in Orlando, scanning boarding passes for a budget airline. Gone was the sharp tone, the proud posture. Heather had become quiet, humble. She no longer believed she had the right to judge others, because she had learned power without empathy is just a first-class ticket to loneliness. One day, a young black girl nervously dropped her boarding pass. Heather bent down, picked it up, and smiled gently. "It's all right, sweetheart. Don't worry. Take your time. We all get shaky sometimes." The girl didn't know the story behind that smile, but within it lived something real, the remorse of a woman who had finally met her own shadow. As for Dr. Amara Lewis, she returned to research and began teaching part-time at a university in Boston. In her classes, she never told the flight story as a victory, but as a lesson in how humans and systems can both be repaired. One day, a student asked, "Do you ever feel angry about what they did to you?" She smiled and replied, "Of course, but if I let anger control me, then I'm no better than a buggy program. I chose to update myself so the error wouldn't repeat." Then she added, "Just like an aircraft engine, if you calibrate it right, it'll take you farther. But if you overload it with heat and pride, you'll lose control." Her lecture became a landmark case study in aerospace ethics, quoted widely as a model for understanding bias and integrity in high-tech environments. Robert Stanton, now fully retired, kept in touch with her. Every time he called, he'd start with the same joke. "Hey, Seat 24B, do you still remember that flight that made the world relearn its manners?" And Amara would always laugh softly. "I do, Robert. But what makes me happier is knowing that since that day, no one's been kicked out of first class just because they didn't look the part." Time passed, and the Williams Ascent Foundation grew. At its third annual scholarship ceremony, Amara presented awards to 12 young women studying aerospace engineering, all daughters of working-class families. One of them cried as she spoke, "I want to be an engineer like you, not to prove anything, but to build planes that keep everyone safe, no matter their color or status." Amara hugged her and whispered, That's when the world truly takes flight, my dear. At 36, Amara was named one of Aviation Ethics Review's top 10 people redefining morality in global aviation. But when asked about her legacy, she just smiled. If I leave anything behind, it's not awards or titles. It's the fact that I was once put down but chose to stand tall. And because of that, others can now stand taller too. In one final interview with Robert Stanton for American Voices, he asked if you could say one thing to those watching, especially anyone who's ever been looked down on. What would it be? Amara paused, then spoke softly, her voice steady as steel. They might not believe in you. They might try to diminish you, but they can't take your worth unless you let them. Hold on to your dignity and let your intellect speak, because in the end, justice always knows how to fly in the right direction. The story of Dr. Amara Lewis isn't just about restoring justice on a single flight. It's a reflection of how we, as human beings, can choose wisdom over anger, dignity over confrontation, and forgiveness over revenge. When she was insulted, she didn't shout. She didn't try to humiliate anyone in return. She let her knowledge and her humanity speak for her, and because of that, an entire system was forced to change. The message is simple, yet profound prejudice is society's bug. If we fail to recognize and fix it, we risk grounding the entire world. Each of us has our own flight in work, in life, in the choices we make. What keeps that journey steady isn't status, race, or class. It's honesty, self-respect, and how we treat others when power's in our hands. So, if you've ever felt looked down upon, remember this. Your worth doesn't need anyone's permission. And if you're ever in a position of power, let empathy travel with authority, because that's the only way we can truly fly far, without losing who we are. Thank you for spending time with this story. If you believe that justice and compassion still have a place in this world, hit like, share this video, and subscribe to help us spread more stories of dignity, wisdom, and the strength of the human spirit.